Good morning. I'm Kimberly Charrington, and I would like to welcome each of you on behalf of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, otherwise known as NIDS, for tuning in to today's Huessy Seminar, where the most important interaction is with you. NIDS is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that provides deterrence education by hosting live and virtual events, podcasts, publications on global security, as well as workshops and courses through our NIDS Academy, all in the interest of advancing peace and promoting stability through a strong national security and nuclear deterrent. You can see more of what we have to offer and get involved at thinkdeterrence.com. Please help us grow our membership and our audiences by following us on LinkedIn, X, Rumble, and YouTube, as well as wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Our next virtual Huessy Seminar will be held next Friday, June 13th, with Lieutenant General Eun Chun, retired Lieutenant General in the South Korean Army, and he will be sharing his perspectives on the implications of nuclear-armed South Korea. He's a fabulous speaker, and you won't want to miss that talk next Friday. June 11th, we have Rose Gottenmuller, former NATO Deputy Secretary General, speaking on arms control. July 18th, we have Matt Kronig, Senior Director of Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. That invitation will be coming out soon. And July 25th, we have Greg Weaver, Strategic Imperatives, Augmenting Theater Nuclear Forces for the 21st Century. We have a full lineup in August and September, so stick with us and we'll give you invitations to all of those upcoming virtual events. But don't miss our next live event at the Capitol Hill Club in Washington, D.C. Uzi Rubin will be joining us on June 27th, addressing the growing concerns of missile threats in the Middle East. You can look for these invitations in your inbox or go to thinkdeterrence.com to our events page to register. You can also email me to get your colleagues on the guest list for all of our future events. During our presentation today, we encourage you to write your questions in the chat box at any time. When we begin the Q&A portion of the presentation, one of us will read the question that you submitted. If you like the question that someone posts, feel free to give it a thumbs up right there in the chat box so we can give that one priority. I want to introduce our host for today's Huessy Seminar, Mr. Peter Huessy, of course, President and Senior Director of Strategic Deterrence Studies at Geostrategic Analysis and Senior Fellow here at NIDS. Peter?
Thank you very much, Kimberly, and welcome to all our guests today. I want to say particularly thank you and greet some of our sponsors that are here today, including Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and JRC, among others. Welcome and thank you for your support and your over many, many years in many cases. So we are honored today to have Matt Costlow, who is a senior analyst at the National Institute for Public Policy. His areas of expertise are in nuclear deterrence, missile defense policy, arms control, Russian and Chinese nuclear doctrine. And in particular, he has written considerable amount of monographs and studies on ICBMs, which of course are my favorite subject. And his work has been published by the Comparative Strategy and the Strategic Studies Quarterly. He's also been published numerous times in the Wall Street Journal, War on the Rocks, Defense News, and Defense One. He works with the National Institute, and he graduated from Missouri State University in 2012, and then he had a master's in Defense and Strategic Studies. He is now writing a thesis on gunboat diplomacy in the South China Seas, and that was chosen for publication by the U.S. Air Force Institute for National Security Studies. I understand he's now working on his PhD at George Mason University, and he's writing a dissertation on the intersection of leadership perceptions and war termination in World War II. Matt, on behalf of NIDS, I want to thank you for coming to talk to us here today. And in particular, Matt is going to talk about, instead of the bilateral relationship between the United States and various nuclear powers, what happens if they get together and jointly decide to do some bad stuff? So that's a horse of a different color. Very difficult to walk through all of that. But Matt, on behalf of Jim Petrosky, who is our president, and Curtis McGriff, who's here, our Vice President, is joining us today. I want to thank you for coming to talk to us today, and over to you, sir.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, and thank you to National Institute for Deterrence Studies. I've long been a fan of your work, and Peter, you've been a giant in this field for so long. So it's always great to reconnect with everyone and meet some new people. And I'm especially happy that we got this many people on a Friday morning to talk about perhaps one of the most dire subjects. That's one of the reasons I titled my recently released monograph, Deterring the New Pacing Threats, because it struck me that what we are dealing with is not just an additional threat. It's not just one more threat along with Russia and China. This is a wholly new, unique set of threats that we have encountered elements of before, but not quite to this severity and not quite to this scale. So I wanted to walk through a little bit of why I wrote this report, and I think you all have gotten copies of it in the invitation emails. So thank you to Kimberly for inserting those. But if you do want a copy, it's available on the nipp.org website. So I wrote this Deterring the New Pacing Threats, Opportunistic and Coordinated Aggression, partly because I saw lines in the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review that essentially said, hey, look, we acknowledge that opportunistic aggression is a possibility. Russia and China are working together. They have their regional partners with North Korea and Iran. So we acknowledge that we may need to use nuclear weapons or rely more on them in a opportunistic aggression scenario where we're fighting in one area and another adversary decides to use that opportunity to advance his or her regional aggressive designs in another area. Strike while the iron is hot, proverbially. And all it said was, we acknowledge that this is an extreme circumstance and we would need to rely more on nuclear weapons simply because the United States is not built to fight two major conventional wars on opposite ends of the globe at the same time. And I asked multiple STRATCOM commanders, J5, OSD, current and former, and ask them, okay, what does this mean, rely more on nuclear weapons in this extreme circumstance? And all of them essentially said, well, that's just a phrase. No one has actually put it together what that might mean, whether that means increased signaling with them, whether that means a lower threshold, whether that means threatening a lower threshold, posture changes like putting bombers on alert. It could mean a ton of different things. And so that got me thinking there needs to be some sort of attempt, even if it's not going to be ever comprehensive. There should be an attempt to put together what opportunistic aggression and coordinated aggression really look like historically, today, and then what are those effects or potential effects on the US nuclear posture? So I chose two case studies to look at that question. First, to historical analogies, as Clausewitz said, are always the best indicators because they actually happened. And the trick is making sure they're not so unique that they don't have any lessons for today. So I went to the atomic age, Cold War, and I looked at the Korean War, in which we were fighting on the Korean Peninsula, but also facing pressure to send troops to the newly formed NATO, which was 1949. So that was a case of actual opportunistic aggression as a threat. We were very concerned the Soviets would invade Europe while we were bogged down in Korea. And the second case study I chose was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, everyone's very familiar with the situation in Cuba, but it's best to think of the Cuban Missile Crisis as a case of deterring opportunistic aggression, because just the year before was the Berlin Crisis, 1961. And so the Cuban Missile Crisis was really a continuation, in one sense, that the Kennedy administration actively thought early on that the Cuban Missile Crisis was something of a head fake from the Soviets, that they wanted to do something in Korea, or excuse me, in Cuba, in order to take Berlin. And so I thought these are two good case studies to look at to see how have U.S. officials approached the problem of opportunistic aggression previously, and what worked, what didn't work, what are some of the lessons learned, and then we can apply that to today and the U.S. nuclear posture and conventional posture today. So I think one of the things that really serves as a good bottom line upfront kind of tagline for the report is thinking about how dangers are multiplied in the threat environment of deterring opportunistic and coordinated aggression. Let me illustrate. If we think about a China-Taiwan scenario, it quickly becomes apparent that it's not simply a China problem, right? This is a conflict with a peer adversary while deterring another different peer adversary. And so the difference is enormous between the two. In one, you are just trying to deter one state. And in another, you're trying to deter one state, or excuse me, fight with one state while deterring another large state that you know is opportunistic and wants to strike while the iron is hot. So when facing this threat of opportunistic aggression, think of it this way: the consequences of failure in one theater are actually multiplied and may directly impact whether deterrence works or holds in the second theater. So each failure of the military failure, the operational, the strategic, the diplomatic, each of those failures in one theater actually becomes magnified and grows because there's multiple audiences. There's the direct audience and there's the indirect audience. And when you're signaling potential failure, getting bogged down in one conflict, then the already revisionist power in the second theater is going to take that signal and potentially run with it. And regrettably, it only gets worse from here. This is sort of the perfect storm that we're entering, because not only are Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran all revisionist powers, all opportunistic in their nature, but they're also facing the United States, which is at a low point, frankly, in terms of its military readiness, in terms of its ability to project power. So these states that are already looking for weakness in the United States are readily able to find those weaknesses, adapt their strategies to exploit those weaknesses, and then all their aggressive nature just takes over from there. And again, remember that there's cooperation now between these four major adversaries. You see Russia and North Korea trading personnel and technology. You see Russia and Iran trading, again, drone making and who knows what else that Russia is providing them, but certainly something in their nuclear realm. So those are the three factors, right? Unique threats of opportunistic and coordinated aggression, a U.S., at least as the adversaries perceive it, as increasingly weak and able to be taken advantage of. And then third is their increasingly cooperative nature between the adversaries. So all of these factors leads me to believe there are essentially four dilemmas or quandaries, if you will, that the threats of opportunistic and coordinated aggression impose on the US. And I'll just kind of list those four and explain each of them briefly. And part of this comes out of the two case studies, and part of it just comes from deductive logic that this is, there's only so many actions the US can take. And that's just what we're constrained by. So the first kind of major dilemma that opportunistic and coordinated aggression present is that the risk of conflict may grow as adversaries that otherwise might be willing to delay aggression see an opportunity where the risks and potential costs are acceptable, given the US and allied constraints. So whether that's perceived military, perceived political constraints, all of these things could play into it. Someone like China may believe that the US is unable to gather the forces needed to stop an invasion of Taiwan. If so, that local balance of power is in its favor, and therefore it's good of them to, it's the right time for them to invade. Whereas the not exclusive other option is they may believe the US is just uninterested in defending Taiwan. Politically, they may see some polls in the US that say the American people don't really care what happens in Taiwan. They may not appreciate some of the commitments the US has made to Taiwan over the years, or current commitments. And so the risk of conflict actually increases in this scenario because, again, the danger is multiplied. If they believe that there is some combination of lack of political will or lack of military capability that makes the US unlikely to come to its ally or its partner's aid, given all of its other commitments. Again, the United States is not only deterring one adversary at a time. We don't have that luxury. Whatever we do to help an ally or a partner has to be within our limits as a power in order that we don't actually induce deterrence failure in another theater. We can't just shift as much military power to a conflict or a crisis without actually thinking through whether that could cause deterrence failure elsewhere. The risk of conflict just grows under opportunistic and coordinated aggression scenarios. The second major quandary I would highlight is that without changes in US conventional or nuclear force postures, the United States may be forced to prioritize one set of allies over another in the case of opportunistic or coordinated aggression. And ultimately, it could cause damage to both sets of allies. So let me illustrate a little bit with the Korean War. General MacArthur wanted far more forces to be sent into Korea to cause a quick end to the conflict and shift all those forces over to NATO. And generally, Europe was quite supportive of the United States in its initial actions to rescue all the U.S. forces that had been driven back all the way to the south the southernmost tip of South Korea. And they had even sent forces to back up the US forces and support them at Incheon and drive everyone back to the 38th parallel. But President Truman soon started receiving frantic calls from European leaders at around the 38th parallel when US forces were about to drive North Korean forces even further north. And European leaders who had been staunchly pro-United States actions up to that point then started saying, no more. End your conflict in Korea. Don't drive North Korean forces all the way back to the border. We need all of those forces that you're using in Korea to shore up this kind of nascent NATO experiment that had only been going on for 2 years. Whereas all the allies in Asia and partners in Asia, we were still occupying Japan at the time, but we were sensitive to the Japanese government's views and sensitive to the South Korean government's views and a number of other Asian allies. They wanted to send a direct threat to the newly formed Chinese Communist Party and to the Soviet Union. They said the communists should suffer a defeat that cannot be ignored or explained away. It should be a crushing defeat that decisively shows the Soviet Union and secondarily Communist China that aggression won't be allowed against the US or its allies. And so there was these competing allied asks of the Truman administration. Truman had both options available to him, and he had to choose whether to support the effort in NATO or to support or rely more heavily on the conflict in Korea. And ultimately, he chose NATO, which led to him capping the number of forces that could be committed to Korea. It wasn't a completely successful split of the baby, proverbially. The Asian allies were unhappy. The Korean War essentially drew to a draw where the borders went essentially back to normal, what they were pre-war, with a little minor variation. But again, this illustrates the difficulties of deterring opportunistic aggression. Two different sets of allies can have two different sets of, in this instance, competing priorities. And there's really not a good way to prioritize both. Let me move to the third quandary. Without changes to the US conventional force posture, the United States may need to rely more on its nuclear forces when deterring or defeating opportunistic and coordinated aggression. This is essentially getting to the point that I mentioned earlier, that the NPR had mentioned what this relying more on nuclear weapons might mean. And in looking at the historical case studies, there's a couple of different kind of lessons that come out of those. One is the importance of regional nuclear forces when it comes to opportunistic aggression. One of the difficulties, and I know many of you on this call are familiar with this, one of the major difficulties of US preferred strategy is we gather up our forces in the homeland, project them from the homeland overseas to meet a growing threat. That takes a lot of time. And in this world today, currently, that's going to become increasingly under pressure in ways that the Korean War and the Cuban Missile Crisis just couldn't match in terms of scope and scale. What that means is there's going to be an increased importance on forces that are already within the theater. And there's simply no substitute for the power and the speed and the psychological deterrent effect of nuclear weapons in theater. And we see this actually a little bit in the Cuban Missile Crisis in two different kind of scenarios. In one, President Kennedy and Secretary of Defense McNamara wanted to increase the alert rate of the United States to be to signal the Soviets that the United States was ready for any particular move on Berlin, that they would not let that stand, but also elsewhere. There were concerns that the Soviets might try to attack Turkey or signal a new North Korean interest in retaking South Korea. So there was a lot of uncertainty, especially early on in the conflict, where people just didn't know where the Soviets were going to go with things. And so Kennedy and McNamara both wanted to increase the military readiness levels so they could be prepared, and it would actually give the president more options should the need arise. The problem was they hadn't seen any Soviet nuclear force changes at that time. Their missiles didn't seem to be on a higher rate of alert. Their bombers didn't seem to be on a higher rate of alert. So they didn't want to cause an unnecessary kind of escalation of alert levels. And so they ordered Strategic Air Command to do it, quote, quiet and gradually. And because Strategic Air Command had practiced this before, they were able to do it. They were able to quietly call back reserves, to quietly change the alert levels on bases in a way that they knew would be seen by the Soviets, but also not do it so rapidly that it would cause the Soviets to think the United States was about to strike. And so that worked out very well. And General Curtis LeMay, after the war, gave a short interview in which he said, this was a silent umbrella, as he called it, that allowed U.S. conventional forces to actually operate in the way we wanted them to, without having to fear the Soviets were going to attack them. The regional side of this is the commander of EUCOM at the time received the same notice that he was to put his forces on alert, but he didn't receive any instructions about doing it quietly. Something got garbled along the way. And so he actually, on his own initiative, did it quietly and gradually. And he was of the mind that the Soviets hadn't put their forces on alert. And so it was in the US best interest to put our forces on alert, but do it in a way that sent the signal we wanted without sending any unintended signals. And so in my mind, that actually, to jump ahead a little bit to my recommendations, that further demonstrated the value of something like the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile, the nuclear Slickamen. That is sort of the ultimate weapon that can boost military readiness and potentially signal. It's less useful as a signal because you have to surface the submarine, but it does grow the ability of the U.S. to have more options during a crisis or conflict without actually sending an unintended signal to the adversary. Let me jump to my final quandary that came out of this. If political goals remain unchanged, that is, if U.S. political goals that have kind of been set for a long time about defending allies and partners and defending as far forward the homeland as possible, if all of that remains unchanged, then the United States may need to rely on riskier, i.e., more escalatory conventional and nuclear strategies during a conflict that hold out the hope of a faster, more satisfactory resolution to a conflict, in the further hope of then shifting those forces to deter in the second theater. Again, this is illustrated well by the Korean War. General MacArthur, early on in the war, made this exact argument. He was extremely concerned to move as many forces to NATO as he could, and that is why he was pushing so hard to have the authority to use bombers and even troops to go across the Yalu River and into China. Because during the war, there was this tacit agreement between US and Chinese forces that US bombers and fighters would not enter Chinese airspace and vice versa. That was partly to quell the fears of the Japanese, who were, again, reconstituting themselves as a society under the US military's leadership. So keeping airplanes out of the Japanese airspace was a high priority. General MacArthur believed if you want to avoid a long drawn-out conflict in which the American people will eventually tire of it, you have to take more escalatory steps in order to win it quickly. So it's a trade-off. Do you want to act in a more escalatory way in order to potentially win the conflict and then shift those forces to better deter in the second theater, which would itself be an important deterrence message, right? If you win decisively in one theater, that should help you deter better in the second theater. One of the more discomforting, at least for the American mind, ideas that comes out of this, one of the biggest implications is if there is a 50-50 chance that the president wants to use nuclear weapons in the first theater, say US forces are losing badly, there's a strategic turning point in the conflict, and the president is sort of torn about whether to use nuclear weapons to defend US forces or not. You can imagine a US leader saying, we should use them, first, because it will help us tactically, operationally, but second, it'll also send a message to the adversary in the second theater and deter him from opportunistic aggression, because now the United States has shown itself to be willing to employ nuclear weapons to defend its allies, to defend its interests. That is an example of a more escalatory strategy in order to potentially save face in both conflicts. Again, it goes back to the idea that failure in one theater hurts you multiple ways. It hurts you in that theater, and it hurts you in the second theater and potentially other theaters. And so for the US, this is sort of an especially difficult lesson because the United States is not really accustomed to throwing out nuclear threats. Russia does it quite regularly. China does it not very regularly, but it is quite adept at sending coercive threats in other manners. I believe it was Freddie Clay during the 1980s. He said that our adversaries are fluent in the language of deterrence threats. They threaten their own citizens every single day. They are just more fluent in the language of coercion than we are. So one of the implications that comes from this study is that, the United States is really going to have to think hard about how it wants to signal with its forces, how it wants to appear more credible, both in the current conflict and a secondary conflict, and then how best to appear credible in that scenario. Is it best to use bombers? Is it best to surface submarines? And it comes back down to, what does tailored deterrence require? Does China view submarines as more credible than US bombers, or vice versa? That's something only kind of intel analysts and people deep in the field can help recognize. So let me sort of conclude my remarks by going through a few of the forced posture recommendations that I have that kind of come out of this study. The first of them is um, making sure that central deterrence holds as the topmost rung of the escalation ladder. So that likely will involve uploaded warheads to the ICBMs. That probably means additional Columbia class, again, recognizing that that is a longer term project. There's no easy solution to bring Columbia to the left. It probably will mean more B-21 bombers. It should also make us think about road mobile ICBMs, going off of one of the recommendations of the Strategic Posture Commission of 2023, studying road mobile again. That might get you far more deterrence bang for your buck in terms of ensuring central deterrence holds in this kind of two nuclear peer problem threat environment. I think most of my recommendations, though, focus on the regional nuclear aspect of things. And I think that is where SLCMN comes in, but that is, again, in the words of the Strategic Posture Commission, necessary but not sufficient. I believe adding more to the regional nuclear force level is probably what's going to be required. It's sort of one of the missing links of US nuclear strategy. It helps assure our allies far more than a bomber sitting in Missouri does. And it's something that you can point to within the region that adversaries cannot try to deter from entering the region through strikes on our US homeland. So I think examples of that might include a nuclear variant of the US Army's long-range hypersonic weapon, Dark Eagle. That should be a possibility. And I think even down, I would advocate for developing a mobile, ground-launched, short to intermediate range ballistic missile. Now, whether that has a hypersonic glide vehicle attached to it, I'll let the engineers and the intel analysts debate all that in a skiff. But the point is, it is a shorter range weapon that can be deployed in theater as a visible manifestation of the US commitments. And it also gives the US tactical and operational advantages that, again, don't have to rely on US homeland support, because US homeland power projection is increasingly going to be contested. And then I'll just end with missile defense of the homeland. I think it's critical that the US decreases the vulnerability to the homeland as much as possible. If we are going to face opportunistic and coordinated aggression to the scale that certainly appears feasible, then our vulnerability to coercive threats, from singles to dozens and dozens of missiles from adversary submarines or bombers, though that vulnerability to coercion may tip the scales in adversary eyes that tells them, yeah, I think I actually have a military theory of victory that could succeed. And so to the extent that we're able to deter and defeat those military theories of victory that rely on coercing the US homeland, that's all to the better. That's all. We would rather them have to face US forces in theater in a contest that we think we could win over the long term. So I will conclude my remarks there. I greatly look forward to the Q&A, And thank you again to Peter and to NIDS for hosting me.
Thank you very, very much, Matt. Extraordinary. But I have a question that I thought pretty early on in your presentation. To what extent will Russia and China see a nuclear armed North Korea, and let's say there is a nuclear armed Iran, as rogue state clients whom they can direct to do things? And will that include not just directing them, but using or potentially threatening the use of nuclear weapons?
I
And
think
the
they
flip
would.
side of that, Matt, is
Yeah.
that Russia and China, despite their rhetoric, have no interest in stopping proliferation among their friends.
No, I think that's right. I think the way to think of them are nuclear armed buffer states. They are quite happy if the United States, in defending its allies, gets bogged down too much in North Korea or Iran, uses up too much of its conventional forces inventory, and then leaves them with an advantage in their local balance of forces. Now, to the extent that they can actually influence the leaders of North Korea and Iran, I think they can certainly influence them long term. They can essentially hold at risk what keeps those regimes alive long term economically. Whether that holds in the moment, uh, again, Iran is something of a theocratic regime. North Korea is famously unstable and erratic. Whether their threats of long term, keeping those regimes alive long term, would be enough to deter or coerce or dissuade North Korea and Iran from acting in ways they don't want them to, I don't know.
Couple of questions in the chat boxes. I'll read it to you. It says, in your view, how well positioned is the current and projected U.S. stockpile to respond to what you just consider the three-body problem? What will this mean for future stockpile options and planning?
Well, first I would modify that it's not quite the three-body problem. I didn't quite go so far as to say it's the five-body problem. But that's sort of the nature of opportunistic and coordinated aggression. It doesn't actually have to be China invading Taiwan and then Russia on the other side. It could be a North Korean provocation of South Korea and then Russia in Europe, or Iran against Israel. So we really, as much as I agree, the three-body problem of two nuclear peers plus the United States is sort of the driver. It's more than that. It's opportunistic and coordinated aggression is actually the greater issue. In terms of stockpile changes, I don't think we are well positioned. I broadly align myself with the Strategic Posture Commission in that the kind of 80 pits per year is a floor, not a ceiling. And to the extent that we can start planning ahead and saying, that's nice, 50 pits at Savannah, there's a lot of room to grow at Savannah. They planned for a bigger floor plan than that, bigger production capacity than that. So to the extent that we can move left, that would be great. That's really difficult to do. But if we can at least start thinking ahead and saying, yeah, 80 was nice. That was the plan in 2010 when most of these requirements were set in a much more benign world. But we're going to need more than that to deter this opportunistic and coordinated aggression threat.
I have a question from Lawrence Doherty, kind of interesting question. Said, putting aside the U.S. support for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, he says, from a practical deterrent standpoint, what would be so terrible about a nuclear-armed South Korea or Japan?
Well, I think that's one of the major debates that's going to happen, and actually you see that with a sort of a tick in the South Korean and Japanese polls of their domestic populaces, where they are actually considering this more. And generally, I am against allied friendly proliferation at this point, mostly because I think it would lead to greater instability in the region. If South Korea goes nuclear, I think it's far more likely that Japan also goes nuclear. And uh, given the historical animosity between China, South Korea, Japan, and all the interconnectedness there, I don't see that as beneficial to the U.S. interests. I think it would actually hurt the U.S. interests in terms of being able to protect U.S. national interests in the area. I think allies that are more dependent on the U.S. nuclear guarantee are probably in the U.S. national interest. Um, and there's also the practical consideration of, would China allow South Korea to go nuclear? That sort of transition period where it sure seems like they're going to go nuclear, but they haven't gotten there yet, or they're just a nascent capability. Um, no one has done a very good study on this that I have seen so far, but what would China be willing to do if two or one of its historically greatest threats starts to gain nuclear weapons? They've already said what they would do if Taiwan would try to get nuclear weapons, and that was attack them. How much more would South Korea and Japan, both of whom China doesn't exactly have great historical relations with, what happens if they try to go nuclear?
Another question came up about winning a theater counterforce exchange in order to have a strong theater deterrent in the Western Pacific. And that would be things like IRBMs and air delivered standoff weapons. You mentioned the Slickum N, as well as a long range or medium range Army missile capability. Would you lay out a little bit more about a theater counterforce exchange issue in the Western Pacific?
Sure. It's the obvious point is there's fewer pieces of land in the Western Pacific to launch from. You have
True.
the first island chain, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines. Philippines is sort of a wild card. We've historically had good relations with them before, to the extent that we even hosted a lot of naval assets there, and we've even deployed the Army's long-range hypersonic weapon there. That would be great if we could leverage that. But I think just given the uh, geography of the region, it will mostly have to be sea-based missiles. And that's sort of the difficulty, is because these sea-based missiles are the ones that take up the most space. Yeah, the bombers you can kind of load up, but sea-based, they're at sea for such a long time that it's going to be very difficult to um, load them up with enough conventional and nuclear weapons that they can accomplish both missions well, right? And so that actually leads to an interesting idea that was tossed around in the 1980s and may potentially have to make a comeback, is the idea of insertables, right? It's a physics package that you could insert into an otherwise conventional warhead. That physics package would take up far less room on a submarine or a surface ship. And um, if you need it, fine, it's there, you can use it. But if it's typically going to be a conventional fight and you want it to stay a conventional fight, well, then you still have all the same number of conventional missiles that you would normally. Um, and again, it's the break in case of emergency option in terms of nuclear weapons. Now, again, that's probably more of a long-term um, idea, but I wouldn't underestimate the creativity of our labs. If you give them a signal of urgency and the funding necessary, I think they could do it. But it's these sort of out of the box thinking that we're probably going to need if we're going to have a chance to deter these threats.
Another question, Matt, is let's say you have what are called non-coordinated attacks, and they're random from North Korea, Iran, even Pakistan, as you saw recently in South Asia. To what extent, instead of playing whack-a-mole, meaning send forces over somewhere to take care of business, you deploy regional and global missile defenses where you don't have to send offensive forces, but you can deal with the threat to the extent which your missile defense and air defenses can deal with everything from drones to ballistic missiles?
Yeah, it gets to the broader importance of having really capable allies. To the extent that you can help your allies grow their in-theater forces, the ones that are going to be at the very, very front lines. I think you can see this today with South Korea and the missile defenses that they're building. I think you have a very good chance to broaden the US-Japanese missile defense relationship. That's already very strong with the SM-3 family. I think Japan is very well positioned for a greater impact of that. Again, it depends on what the military theory of victory is for each adversary. One of the reasons that I wasn't able to get to in my presentation that I think missile defenses are so important is that if you think Russia or China, potentially even North Korea, depend on this idea of a fait accompli, doing a really fast, successful land grab, and then presenting that as a come and take it sort of proposition to the US and the Allies, then missile defenses become incredibly important because it helps take away that coercive threat, at least initially. It helps buy time for more significant assets to either get airborne or get shipped out to sea. And it also provides cover for leaderships that are wanting to resist this coercive threat from adversaries. So missile defenses, both U.S. homeland, like allies need to know that we're not going to get coerced into not supporting them, right? And we don't want to get coerced out of something we don't want to do. Plus, regional defenses in their homelands. I think it's incredibly important for defeating the fait accompli threat that a adversary like China or Russia might present.
Going back to your analogy of talking about Korea and NATO during the Korean War, one of the things I find interesting is that while people will talk about the number of nuclear weapons being built by various countries around the world and what the growth is, what's missing is what are they going to do with them? And that raises the next issue, which is what do you think China and Russia's objectives are with respect to the arsenal that China definitely has dramatically changed the dimensions of its nuclear forces. And Russia has not only a big breakout capability, but it's unclear to me, if we haven't had inspections for 2.5 years, at least, is that what do the Russians actually have deployed versus what they're allowed under the New START Treaty? As Mark Schneider points out, your colleague at NIP, they have a huge breakout capability, if not already being deployed, where it's unclear. So my question is, and this is a question that the former chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, former Secretary of Defense, the late, Mr. Les Aspin, God love him. He'd always ask and said, "You keep telling me how many beans the bad guys have. Is what are they going to do with them that they couldn't do if they didn't have them?" So that's a long question, Matt, but I think that's the most important question, which is what is it that China and Russia are seeking to accomplish? What are their objectives? Because saying that, oh, they're just trying to deter America by overcoming our missile defenses, which is what FAS and Plowshare said just recently in the Washington Post, it makes their nuclear weapons look benign because, oh, they're just trying to deter.
Yeah, agree completely. If they had wanted to just overcome our missile defenses, they really wouldn't have had to have changed much, right? Because we only have 44 interceptors for the homeland, and they're geared against the North Korean threat. So I think it's laughable that China is quintupling its nuclear arsenal simply because of the fear of U.S. missile defenses. No, it all gets back to what are the national aims of China and Russia, and how do nuclear arms fit into that, right? It's
Right.
the old policy drives strategy, strategy drives operations. And
Right.
what their national policy is inherently revisionist. Russia has just historically always sought to expand its borders further and further beyond Moscow in order to defend that part of their country. Um, their security is wrapped up in the insecurity of others. That's how they've always defined it. Uh, so to the extent that they can make trouble on their borders and meet the adversary at the borders as far away from their heartland as possible, they're quite happy with that. And unfortunately, there's not much in the Russian geography that stops them. It's all flat plains. There's no natural barrier to their expansionism. For China, I've seen their attitude to Taiwan compared to the South in the US Civil War. It would have been like Great Britain siding with the South during the during the Civil War. That's how we would feel, or that's how China feels the US support to Taiwan is like. It's interference in a domestic um,
Yes.
dispute, but it actually goes beyond that. It's the CCP has been promising to get Taiwan back, to end the century of humiliation. And so they've been promising this to kind of stoke nationalism and keep the CCP in power. And now they're getting painted into a deterrence cul-de-sac, as my boss Keith Payne likes to say. They've been promising this aggressive action for a long time, and now their people are calling for it, and they're being forced to decide: do we do it in 2027? Do we wait? And that's where their nuclear forces come in. They see themselves as needing top cover, or at least threatening that top cover, in order to allow a conventional invasion of Taiwan. If they need to use nuclear weapons, I believe they would. The no first use policy of theirs is not binding in the least. So it's these national aims are being manifested through their nuclear forces more and more every day. And as Colin Gray used to say, ambition grows with power, and we see their
Absolutely.
power growing every day. That's
Absolutely.
what should concern us most with opportunistic aggression.
Well, we've reached 11 o'clock, but I wanted to turn it over to Curtis, our vice president and one of our founders, if he wants to say anything in closing for the next 30 seconds or so. Curtis, if you're there, please take it away, and we'll conclude with your remarks.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Matthew, for being here today. I really enjoy these conversations. It really sparks the way we think about strategy and policy and how it affects others. And I think, the way America engages with its regional allies and the setting of expectations with regional allies, I think is probably the first place to sort of have this conversation and where we're going with this. And the idea of how much we should and could empower and encourage our allies to take ownership of their regions, if nothing else, to augment what hard power we have, given a $37 trillion debt and all of the other challenges that we have here domestically. So there's lots to think about, and I commend your thought process here. Because it is very analytical. And what it allows, I think, strategists to do is to look at each one of those things that you've identified, dissect them, and then begin to find the cure. And if you can find the cure for each one of these, cumulatively, you might be able to begin to solve a problem. And so thank you for that hard work, and I appreciate it. And on behalf of National Institute for Deterrence Studies and all of our great audience here, thank you again for being here. Appreciate it very much. Peter, back to you, sir.
Yes, I want to say thank you to Kimberly, she does such a great job organizing these events. And thank you, Matt. It's a privilege to hear what you had to say. This to me is the single biggest issue that our military commanders and their civilian counterparts are now wrestling with. They call it integrated deterrence, but how do you deter on the scale of from conventional to nuclear, given our nuclear forces are designed to stop conventional war, because that's the thing that could escalate to the nuclear level. So it's not just stopping the use of nuclear weapons against us, it's the entire force. And this is something they're wrestling with. In fact, what I hear from them repeatedly is thinking about this, and your contribution to this is really very, very helpful. And I also want to say to those people that have questions that we didn't get to, please send them to Kimberly, and we will pass them on to Matt. And Matt, you can do with them as you see. But again, my best to your friends at NIPP. Great organization, and thank you for taking the time today to chat with us, because this was really very well done and very informative and a lot of food for thought. So again, thank you, Matt, and thank you to all our guests and particularly our sponsors that have helped support this. And we will see you next Friday with our good friend from South Korea, who will talk about the implications of a nuclear-armed South Korea. Take care, everybody.